so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today welcome to my TBR for Victober. So if you don't yet know, Victober or Victorian October is a month-long read-along held in the month of October, and it is hosted by me, by Anne from Beyond the Pages, Lucy the Reader and Kate Howe. I will link all of our channels and announcement videos down below just to let you know more about the challenge. But basically, Victober is all about reading Victorian literature in the month of October, and we have 5 challenges. So I have got a TBR of books that I would like to try and read in Victober. There are probably too many for me to read in 1 month, but we will try. I have 16 books down on this list, which I think it'll be pushing it. Some of them are quite short, some of them are very little things or short stories, but some of them are really quite long, so I think it's probably too many for me to read in a month. In fact, I went through the 16 books that I have and I looked on Goodreads to see how long they all were, and if I were to read all of these things in the month of October, that would be about 6,000 pages, which is quite a lot of pages, and would mean I'd effectively have to read like 190 pages every day in October, which I think is too many. Like, I don't think I can actually read like 190 to 200 pages a day for a whole month. I think that's too much. I'm sure there might be some days when I read 200 pages, but I feel like it's more likely that I will read about 100, 120 pages a day and maybe listen to like half an hour to an hour of an audiobook a day. That's how much I'm actually expecting to read in Victober. So I know that I'm probably not going to get to all of these, but I will try. We're just gonna see how this goes. I'm hoping to get a lot of reading done in October. I'm very excited for a lot of these, so yeah. Let's get straight into what I'm reading for the different challenges. There are 5 challenges for Victober. Each of us 4 hosts have set one, and then there is also a general challenge, and obviously I have 16 books, so there are several books for each challenge, and then I have a couple that don't fit into any challenge. The first challenge, Angie's challenge, is to read a book by one of the host's favourite authors, and our favourite authors collectively are Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell and Thomas Hardy. So I have 3 things that I'm hoping to read for Angie's challenge. The first is Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, which I will definitely be reading. That is a priority because we, as the Victober hosts, are hosting a read-along of Wives and Daughters throughout the month of October. So there are 60 chapters in Wives and Daughters, so I think the plan is to read 2 chapters a day from sort of the 1st to the 30th of October. I love Wives and Daughters a lot. It is one of my favourite Victorian novels. This will be my 3rd reading of it. I read it once as a teenager, I read it again last year, and then I'm going to read it again this year because it is so great and amazing and I love it a lot. I'm going to be listening to this on audiobooks. I have a brilliant audiobook that I listened to last year. The audiobook that I have, which I can heartily recommend, is by Patience Tomalin. It looks like this and it is about 27 hours long. Do be careful because I think Patience Tomalin reads both an abridged and an unabridged version of Wives and Daughters, and you want to make sure you get the unabridged if you want to listen to it on audiobook. So it is, as I said, about 27 hours long. I love Wives and Daughters a lot. It is about a young woman called Molly and what happens when her father decides to remarry, and she suddenly has a stepmother and a stepsister, and things change a lot in her life. It's a wonderful coming-of-age story and a great love story, and so much about like class and small-town life and so many glorious Victorian things. Very, very excited to read this again, even though I only reread it last year because it is that amazing. It is also unfinished. Elizabeth Gaskell died when she had like a chapter left to write. So it's basically, although it is not technically finished, you know exactly how things are going to go. It is fairly wrapped up for an unfinished book. But just to warn you, it is unfinished, but it is still amazing and I love it. I love it a lot. The other 2 things I'm going to be reading for this challenge are both Dickens short stories / novellas. One is Dr. Marigold by Charles Dickens, which is one of his short stories. I have been meaning to read more short stories by Charles Dickens for ages because, you know, he's my favourite author. I've read all of his books, but I haven't read all of his short stories. He wrote quite a lot, which I have yet to discover. And this is one I've been quite interested in reading for a while because I know that one of the main protagonists is deaf, and I've never read about a deaf character in Victorian literature before. As I mentioned in my announcement video for Victober, one of the videos I'm really hoping to make for Victober this year is a video about disability in Victorian literature. So I do have a few books on my Victober TBR that I'm hoping to read in the first half of the month so that I can discuss them in that video. Dr. Marigold is one of them. And then a novella that I'm hoping to read by Charles Dickens is The Cricket on the Hearth. This is one of his Christmas books. I have read it before, but I would quite like to read it again. Something I would like to do later on in the year, in the beginning of December, is a sort of author week on Dickens, but like a Christmas author week, talking about Dickens's Christmas books. Dickens published 5 Christmas books. These are called the Christmas books because they were released sort of the week before Christmas rather than because they're all about Christmas. The Christmas Carol is one of them, obviously that's quite Christmassy, but like The Cricket on the Hearth isn't really very Christmassy, nor is The Battle of Life. The Haunted Man I don't think is Christmassy, and The Chimes is like a New Year story rather than a Christmas story. I really like all of these 5 novellas, but it's been quite a while since I've read some of them, so I'm hoping to reread them before December so that I can make a like mini Christmas author week on Dickens. And I thought I would try and read the more Christmassy ones nearer to Christmas in sort of end of November, but some of the less Christmassy ones I might start with in October, so I think I'm going to read The Cricket on the Hearth. Also, one of the characters in The Cricket on the Hearth is blind, and I remember bits about the presentation, but I think it would be quite useful for me to reread that before I make the video about disability in Victorian literature. And I really like The Cricket on the Hearth. I think from when I read all of Dickens's Christmas books, like 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was probably like my second favourite after A Christmas Carol, so I'm really looking forward to reading that again. So those are the books that I'm going to be reading for Angie's challenge. Now on to Kate's challenge, which is to read a Victorian book with a proper noun in the title, so a place name or a person's name. There are 4 that I'm counting for this challenge because they don't count for any other challenges, but I realised that like, I think all but one of the things I'm reading for my challenge also have proper nouns in the title, as does the thing I'm reading for Lucy's challenge, as does Dr. Marigold that I already spoke about. So yes, the Victorians, they liked their proper nouns, didn't they? So one thing I'm hoping to read for this challenge, which I'm incredibly super looking forward to, is Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. This is the second book in the Palitzer series. I read the first book, Can You Forgive Her, in August and absolutely adored it, so I'm so excited to get to this. And hopefully I'm going to be buddy reading this with Carolyn from Carolyn's Reading Rambles. We buddy read the Barchester Chronicles together and are buddy reading the Palitzer series together, and I'm just really excited. I know very little about this, and I kind of want to keep it that way because I know I love Anthony Trollope's writing style. I know that Mr. Palitzer or various other characters from Can You Forgive Her will crop up in here in some way, and that's all I need to know. So I've just opened it, and the subtitle of the book is The Irish Member. So I assume it's about an Irish man in Parliament, which I think should be really interesting, especially if it examines sort of social and political issues to do with Ireland in the 19th century. I think that could be really interesting, so definitely looking forward to this one. Another rather long one I am picking up for Kate's challenge is East Lynne by Ellen Wood, or by Mrs. Henry Wood, as my very old edition says. This I borrowed from my mum, and I believe this edition is from 1984. And cost £3.95. I have not read the back of this. I try to avoid reading the back of classics in general because publishers of classics do have a great tendency to rather spoil the plots of books on the back, and the further back in time you go into the 80s and the 70s, the more spoilery the backs of books are. A couple of years ago I read Desperate Remedies by Thomas Hardy, and the back of the book spoiled a plot point that you did not find out until the last 5 pages, so there we go. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to this. I've heard a lot of great things about it, especially from Anne from Beyond the Pages, and I think me and Kate Howe are going to be buddy reading this together. I haven't read anything by Ellen Wood before, but I've certainly heard good things, and I believe that this has adultery and lots of scandal and is a bit sensationalist, so very curious and really looking forward to this one. The next 2 I have for Kate's challenge are 2 which I'm hoping will inform my video on disability in Victorian literature. One is Poor Miss Finch by Wilkie Collins. I don't know too much about this book, but I know that the central character, Miss Finch, is blind, or at least partially blind. The book follows sort of her relationship with 2 twins that fall in love with her, I believe. This is one of the books by Wilkie Collins that comes very highly recommended to me by mum. I'm hoping in fact to be able to borrow a copy from her before Victober begins so that I can read it in physical form rather than on my Kindle, but I think it should be really interesting, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading it. I also just want to read more by Wilkie Collins. I've read 3 things by him before. I read The Moonstone and The Woman in White as a teenager and absolutely loved them, and then last October I read The Two Destinies, which I really disliked, and the further I get from it the more I dislike it, so I'm really hoping to read a Wilkie Collins which I will enjoy and which I will get something out of, so yes, looking forward to that one. And the other one is Olive by Diana Mullock-Craik. I don't know too much about Diana Mullock-Craik, but I know I've heard Kate Howe speak about her, and I believe she was included in a book called Not Just Jane, which was about sort of 19th century female authors, which a couple of booktubers I follow read and sort of spoke to me about. I don't think they entirely loved the book, but I think they got some sort of good recommendations of lesser well-known female authors from the 19th century from it, and Diana Mullock-Craik sounded quite interesting. I came across the novel Olive while researching online about disability in Victorian literature, and this book came up several times as being quite an interesting book for presentations of disability in Victorian literature. That's about all I know about it, and that's kind of fine. So those are the things that I'm reading for Kate's challenge, and now on to my challenge, which was to read a book from the first 10 years of the Victorian period and or a book from the last 10 years of the Victorian period. So I have 2 from the first and 3 from the last, though one of the ones from the last is probably my lowest priority book for Victober, so I imagine I probably won't get to it, but we'll see how I go. But the 2 that I have from the first 10 years of the Victorian period are big priorities for me, because both of these were on my TBR for Victober last year and I didn't read either of them, and both of them I was really looking forward to this time last year, and I'm still really looking forward to them, and I can't believe I haven't managed to read them in the last year at all. But the first is Michael Armstrong Factory Boy by Frances Trollope. Frances Trollope is the mother of Anthony Trollope, and she was also a novelist. I love Anthony Trollope a lot, so I'm very keen to read something by his mother because I think it would be really interesting. I don't know that Michael Armstrong is a lesser well-known industrial novel, and I find books from the Victorian period about industrialisation really, really interesting, so I'm really looking forward to that one. That was published in 1840, and then the other one from the first 10 years of the Victorian period I have is Zoe by Geraldine Dewsbury, which was published in 1845. I don't know very much about Zoe at all, but I have read another book by Geraldine Dewsbury, and that was The Half Sisters, which I read a couple of years ago and absolutely loved. It's one of my favourite Victorian novels, and one of the most interesting Victorian novels in many ways. It's a really, really brilliant read. I loved her writing style. I loved the way she examined sort of class and gender and respectability and expectations of women in the Victorian period. I'm sure that Zoe will be excellent too. I can't wait to read something else by her, and I can't believe it's taken me this long. So hopefully I will actually get to Zoe this Victober. I think me and Kate Howe said we might buddy read it, so hopefully that will push me to actually read it this year. Then the 3 books I have from the later Victorian period, going chronologically, the first is The Whirlpool by George Gissing from 1897. This is one of the things that is lower down on my TBR for Victober. I know that I want to read more by George Gissing. I've read 3 of his novels before, The Odd Women, The Netherworld and New Grub Street, all of which I absolutely loved. I think he's a brilliant author. Quite miserable, but also brilliant, and he does really interesting things with gender and class, and also I think he's one of those late Victorian writers where reading his work you really do see a huge difference in sort of general life for people in comparison to the early Victorian period. One thing I find about The Odd Women by George Gissing, which I would certainly recommend for this challenge, is that it feels not exactly modern, but it feels very, very far removed from, you know, stuff like the Brontes, partly in terms of technology, sort of typewriters and people taking the tube, but also in terms of the position of women. He's a really, really fascinating writer, and I know I would like to read something more by him. I don't really mind where I go next, but I have The Whirlpool on Kindle. I've had it for a while. It is supposed to be very good. I don't know too much about it, and I'm happy to keep it that way. This is probably one of my backup books. I'm sure I will read more by George Gissing in the future. It doesn't have to be in Victober. It can be later, perhaps. I do have 2 other books, though, for the latter half of this challenge, which I'm hoping to make a bigger priority in the month of Victober. This is Love, Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells, which I've just got out of the library, and I'm really looking forward to reading. I really like H.G. Wells. I think he's a very interesting writer. He is very famous for his science fiction books, such as The Time Machine, or The Island of Dr. Moreau, or The War of the Worlds, or The Invisible Man. I have read those 4 and really enjoyed them, but more than those 4, I very, very, very much enjoyed his novel Kips, which is from a little bit later on in the Edwardian period and is a non-science fiction novel. It's a realistic novel, much more Dickensian than sci-fi, and I loved it so much and I want to read more of his non-science fiction. Love, Mr. Lewisham is one of H.G. Wells's non-science fiction books. It's from 1900. I believe it follows a science student called Mr. Lewisham and sort of his romantic entanglements and his effort to make a career for himself. I think it should be really, really interesting. I'm really looking forward to this one, hoping it will impress me as much as H.G. Wells's Kips did, and yeah, really excited to get to this one. And then the other one I have is Kim by Rudyard Kipling, which is from 1901. So Queen Victoria died in January of 1901, and I think this was published in book form after her death, but it was serialised, and the serialisation started in December 1900 before Queen Victoria died. So I think technically it's okay. We can say it's Victorian, it's all good. I'm meaning to read this for ages. I have enjoyed some of what I've read of Rudyard Kipling's before. I quite enjoyed The Jungle Book, and I have liked some of his poetry. Quite interested to read Kim. I believe it's about a young boy sort of born to British parents. He's grown up in India, and I'm very interested in the history of sort of British India and British-Indian relationships, so I think this should be a really, really interesting read. So those are the many things I want to read for my challenge. Now on to Lucy's challenge, which is to read a Victorian book written by a woman anonymously or under a pseudonym. I only have one thing down for this challenge, being a bit more restrained this time, and that is Garth Owen by Alan Raine. Alan Raine is the pseudonym of a Welsh female author called Anne Adelesia Bennon Puddicombe. I mean, it's such a shame that she wrote under another name, because that is a much more fun and interesting name than Alan Raine. However, I'm looking forward to this. I believe it is a sort of study in sort of provincial Welsh life. I don't know very much about it, but I do want to read more about Wales in the Victorian period, because it's a part of Britain that I don't know that much about, because in terms of the Victorian period I know quite a lot about Victorian England, a medium amount about Victorian Ireland and Scotland, and very, very, very little about Victorian Wales. I read one Welsh book last Victober, which was The Rebecca Rioter by Amy Dilwyn, which I really, really enjoyed, and I've been meaning since then to read some more about Victorian Wales. I believe Garth Owen was possibly on my TBR for Victober last year, or at least it was one of the things I considered putting on my TBR. I have it on my Kindle, I'm looking forward to reading it, and yeah, I will let you know in my wrap-up how I get on. Moving on to the general challenge, which was to read a Victorian book and watch a screen adaptation of it. Now, weirdly enough, this is the challenge I actually had the most trouble with, because a lot of the things on my TBR this year are quite obscure and don't have adaptations of them, and a lot of the Victorian books that have been made into films or TV series I've read already and I don't necessarily want to reread. I think what I am going to do for this challenge is watch the TV miniseries of Wives and Daughters, because obviously I'm rereading Wives and Daughters anyway for the first challenge and for the read-along, and I really love the screen adaptation of Wives and Daughters, and it's been a very long time since I've watched it. I don't think I've seen it since I was probably sort of 16, 17, and I've obviously reread the book since I saw the screen adaptation, so I think it should be quite interesting to watch the screen adaptation. Also because, as I said, Wives and Daughters is very slightly unfinished and like misses the final moment. It's quite nice to watch the screen adaptation and get that little bit of extra satisfaction. So I'm going to be watching that. But also, if you know of any screen adaptations of any of the books that I've mentioned, please let me know. I don't think there are going to be any for most of them because they are quite obscure. But maybe for Kim by Rudyard Kipling or Love and Mr. Lewisham by H.G. Wells, I don't know. I'm going to do a bit more research and see if I can find a screen adaptation of one of these books that I've never seen before. However, I did say I had 16 books and I've only mentioned 13 so far, so I do have 3 miscellaneous Victorian reads to add on to my TBR for Victober. One is Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. I don't know very much about this except that it is a Victorian comedy novel, which I assume is about 3 men who were in a boat. Last year, Gemma from Whiskey and Woodhouse / Nonfic Books, but this was on her Whiskey and Woodhouse challenge, did a review of this in which she talked about how much she liked it, and it made me really want to read it. I had heard of it, but I didn't really realise it was a Victorian novel, and I never really heard it talked about in the context of Victorian literature, so I'm quite interested to read that, and I think it's quite short as well. I'm hoping to listen to that on audiobook, and I think it'll only be about 6 hours, so that should be quite a fun read. And then finally I have 2 Penguin Little Black Classics, which I'm sure I will be able to fit in over the course of the month. This is As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerald Manley Hopkins. I thought it would be nice to have at least a tiny bit of poetry in this very novel-heavy Victober. I really like Gerald Manley Hopkins. I think he's a very interesting Victorian poet and does very different things with language, which make him feel much more modern than actually he is. He was an English Jesuit priest, and interestingly, although he was a Victorian, he died before the Victorian period ended. He didn't publish any of his work in his life, and it was discovered afterwards and published sort of later into the early 20th century. And weirdly, like, his poetry feels very ahead of its time. It almost feels like it belongs more in the early 20th century when it was published than actually when it was written in the Victorian period. It does very unusual things with language and is really sort of beautiful to read. And as a poet I find really quite interesting, so I'm looking forward to reading a little bit more by him. So Henry Mayhew was a Victorian sort of essayist and man of letters, and this is a little collection from Penguin Little Black Classics of various sort of small essays by him. I think most of them are extracts from his book London Labour and the London Poor, which is a documentation of sort of poverty and work in London in the Victorian period, which I would really like to read actually, maybe next Victober or at some point in the next year, but I would like to at least read a little bit by him. I've read sort of extracts from London Labour and the London Poor before at university for sort of history modules as well as for literature modules, and I think it should be really interesting to read a little bit more by him, and hopefully I will pick up something more substantial by him in the future as well. But yeah, I thought these would be 2 nice shorter additions to fit in Victober between my longer reads. There we have it. That's quite a lot that I'm attempting to conquer in Victober. As I said, I feel like I'm unlikely to actually get to read all of these. At the same time, I really want to read all of them, and I think the only one I sort of have accepted that I'm not going to get to is The Whirlpool, and I've somehow convinced myself that I can read the other 15. We shall see how that goes. I will obviously let you know in my end of month wrap-up how I get on with my attempt to read all these books, but if you would like to follow my reading in the meantime, please do follow me on Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter, where I will be updating and sort of talking about what I'm reading over the course of Victober. I'm also going to be vlogging Victober. I'll be doing weekly vlogs where I will talk about what I'm reading and how it's going and how I'm enjoying it, which I did for Jane Austen in July and really enjoyed, so I'm really looking forward to doing it for Victober as well. I think that's all I have to say. Please let me know down in the comments if you are taking part in Victober, and if you have got your TBR together. Please also go and join the Goodreads group if you'd like to take part in Victober and you're not already a member. There is a big long thread discussion about TBRs and lots of people discussing what they're planning on reading. Also, if you are on BookTube and you have a TBR video, please do send me a link. I would love to see it. I am so excited. I'm so looking forward to all of these books, and yeah, Victober's going to be good. Okay, I think that's it for now. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read any of the books I spoke about today, and if there's anything you'd especially recommend me to start with, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.